Okay, so this is a preview conversation about one of the more famous chapters in the Odyssey, Book 9, which Emily Wilson titles A Pirate, Curious, a pirate, in this case it's Odysseus, in a shepherd's cave. As you'll see, the word pirate is interesting and the word shepherd is interesting because the pirate is unusual and the shepherd is unusual. So as usual, have your copy of Emily Wilson's Odyssey out, something to write with, and what I do with my students, most of whom have never experienced this poem before, is we sort of annotate the chapter in advance, just some highlighted passages, and then we read and listen. So what's important is that this begins a story within a story. Odysseus tells chapter 9, book 9, and for the next few chapters, as his sort of narrative autobiography in the court of Alcinous, so the court of the Phaecians. So it's really important to remember that this is a performance piece in a way. It's important to remember that context. And he begins his story not in Ithaca, not his wooing of Penelope, not his childhood, his scar, his history, his early childhood history. He begins with leaving the Trojan War. And I think it might be interesting to have a discussion about why he thinks that's the beginning of his story. Think of what he's leaving out intentionally here. So this is his post-war autobiography he is offering to Alcinous. First, if you go to line 20, it's the very top of page 241. He does tell the truth. He says who he is. I'm Odysseus, Laertes' son, known for my many clever tricks and lies. My fame extends to heaven, but I live in Ithaca. So he gets the biography, he gets the ID, father's name, which is part of your ID, and then the fact that he's famous, where he's from, and also his number one personality trait, his trickery, his metis, but also his lying. We get just a quick overview, and I just want to fast forward down to line 40 on page 241. He's leaving Troy, and he says the war, and he says a blast of wind pushed me off course towards Cicones and Ismarus. I sacked the town and killed the men. That happened really fast. He doesn't leave to go and attack the people at Cicones in Ismarus. He lands there randomly and attacks them. He says, we took their wives, which is a really euphemistic way of saying rape. We raped their wives and shared their riches equally among us. And then he tried to get his men to leave, but his men, having left war for 10 years, and now are here with endless riches and food and women, want to stay. It's easy to skim over. This is the very first sort of event after their 10 years of combat is they sack and rape and pillage the next place they see. Okay, that's super, super worth thinking about. And they barely escape. So if you look on line 59 on the next page, it says 6 well-armed members of my crew died from each ship. He has 12 ships. So that's, 12 times 6, that's 72, right? Die. This is right after they leave 10 years of combat because of a needless sort of pillaging. He says he tells the story to Alcinous. And then, again, this is done quickly, line 84. They go to the land, the island of those who live on food from lotus flowers, which is a fruit. And some of his people act as scouts, some of his fellow soldiers, and they end up eating the lotus flowers as well. And I want you to go to page 243 to line 93, because here's what lotus flowers do. It says, as they ate it, they lost the will to come back and bring news to me. These are his scouts, Odysseus' own guys. They wanted only to stay there, feeding on lotus with the lotus eaters. And then please circle this next small sentence. It's one of the great sins of the Odyssey. They had forgotten home. that idea of nostos, home. Nostalgia is the desire to return home. It's the number one thing that drives Odysseus. So the very first choice that Odysseus and his men make is to rape and pillage. The second choice many of them to make is to drug themselves. And what the drug does is it dulls pain and it dulls the desire to go home. So the third adventure that's told in greater detail in Book 9 is the cyclops Polyphemus and the island of the Cyclopes, plural for cyclops. So look, I'm aware that by now you might be very comfortable just reading this without being told what's going to happen. I just really like, for my students, again, who are new to this poem, I like highlighting key things and clarifying some things before they enter the poem, and that way they're approaching it with some confidence. So this is up to you if you want to continue on and get some spoilers. It's probably the most famous moment in the poem, most famous set of moments. So if you go to line 106, which is on page 243, they land in the island of the cyclopes, the plural, high-minded cyclopes. They put their trust in gods and do not plant their food from seed nor plow, yet the barley, grain, and clustering wine grapes all flourish. They are increased by rain from Zeus. They have no councils, no common laws, live in caves. So before we meet the vicious Polyphemus, it's important to know that these cyclops live in a very different kind of society than the Greeks. They do put their trust in gods, but they don't plant food, they don't plow, and somehow the gods provide for them. And then also, they don't have laws and councils and the things that normally suggest that they're a civilization. So it's kind of a unique set of circumstances as we're introduced to them. So go to line 216, which is a few pages later, near the bottom of page 246. Odysseus and his men enter into a large cave on the island of the Cyclopes. It says, "We were soon at the cave, but did not find the Cyclops. He was pasturing his flocks. We went inside and looked at everything." So we get a long list of the stuff. We get the cheese and different food, and lambs. And what ends up happening is that the crew begs to just take their things, and they want the lambs and the cheese. And go to line 228 on page 247. Odysseus wants more. Odysseus presumes that they're strangers, so whoever lives in the cave would use Xenia and would treat them with hospitality and give them gifts. And Odysseus says, "I hope to see him and find out if he would give us gifts." And then the sort of foreboding next line, "In fact, he brought no joy to my companions," which is a really nice way of saying what's about to happen. So the Cyclops returns, and it says, a few lines down, 234, "He came at dinner time and brought a load of wood to make a fire. He hurled it noisily into the cave. We were afraid and cowered toward the back. He drove the ewes and nannies inside to milk them, but he left the rams and he-goats in the spacious yard outside." And then a really important choice. "He lifted up the heavy stone and set it to block the entrance of the cave." And this is a stone, as he says later, that 22 carts drawn by horses could not have moved this stone. He ends up seeing them. And if you go to the top of page 248, line 252, he immediately calls them strangers, which again is also the word for immigrants. "Strangers, who are you?" If you remember the rules of Xenia, you don't ask that question first. You take care of the strangers, you feed them, you bathe them. Here he just launches right in. "Who are you? Where did you come from across the watery depths? Are you on business or roaming round without a goal like pirates who risk their lives at sea to bring disaster to other people?" If you skip a paragraph and go to 259, Odysseus tells them roughly who they are. "We're Greeks. We come from the Trojan War. We're Agamemnon's men. and he basically supplicates himself. He begs for good treatment as strangers. Now, the last paragraph on page 248 is really weird. 272. This is the Cyclops' response. Unmoved, he, the Cyclops, said, "Well, foreigner, you're a fool, or from some very distant country. You order me to fear the gods? My people think nothing of that Zeus with his big scepter, nor any god. Our strength is more than theirs. If I spare you or spare your friends, it will not be out of fear of Zeus. I do the bidding of my own heart." So that sounds like a nice sentiment. I do the bidding of my own heart, but it would be really evil in an ancient Greek world to say that, to separate yourself from God's will like that, and to disrespect God's will like that. Now, what ends up happening is Odysseus on the next page, 249, just a few lines down, around line 283, says, "Poseidon the Earthshaker shipwrecked me at the far end of your island." And then what ends up happening, evidently Polyphemus hasn't had his dinner, because in the next little stanza of 286 he says, "But he made no reply and showed no mercy. Leaping up high, he reached his hands toward my men, seized two, and knocked them hard against the ground like puppies, and the floor was wet with brains. He ripped them limb by limb to make his meal, then ate them like a lion on the mountains, devouring flesh, entrails, and marrow bones, and leaving nothing." Make a note in your book, because it was also seen as greatly uncivilized to eat raw meat. So this is just another side of how not civilized Polyphemus would be. He doesn't have councils. He doesn't grow his own food, right? And he eats raw meat. "Watching this disaster, we wept and lifted up our hands in prayer to Zeus." So that's a good instinct. "We felt so helpless. When the Cyclops had filled his massive belly with his meal of human meat and unmixed milk, he lay stretched out among the flocks. Then, thinking like a military man, I thought I should get out my sword." He then realizes the brilliance of Odysseus. He then realizes the problem. If he kills the Cyclops, there's no way for them to move the stone that blocks their exit to the outside world. So here's the plan. The plan has two sides: traditional sort of Greek violence, and what we see on line 319 is that they take Polyphemus's humongous walking stick, which is the size of a mast of a ship, and they sharpen it, burn the edge, and what you see, he gets the Cyclops drunk, and he stabs the Cyclops in the eye. So the violence that they need is to make the Cyclops physically a cripple, so they have a fighting chance against him. The second thing, which is on 366, and this is a point that you'll have to debate and have conversations or write about, is the Cyclops, after being dismembered, asks for the man's name. Odysseus doesn't have to give his name. Odysseus says in line 364 or so, "Cyclops, you ask my name and I will reveal it. Then you must give the gift you promised me of hospitality. My name is No Man. My family and friends all call me No Man." He answered with no pity in his heart, "I will eat no man last. First I will eat the other men. That is my gift to you." All right. So he at this point his eye isn't dismembered. I misspoke earlier, but he's drunk. Odysseus gets him drunk on this very strong alcohol that they were gifted earlier. And there's a disgusting but great detail on the top of page 352, right around line 272. "All-conquering sleep took him," Polyphemus. "In drunken heaviness he spewed wine from his throat and chunks of human flesh." So you can see Odysseus working his plans, getting him drunk so that he can be more helpless, so he can stab him in the eye. But in the meantime, like wine is pouring out of his mouth, and then body parts and bits of his or friends are falling out of his mouth. So he does stab him in the eye. And if you go to 382 to 414, you get sort of a play-by-play of that. But I want to go to the cleverness. Arguably, it's not so much the cleverness so much as, I don't know, maybe it's hasty. Go to line 408. Because when Polyphemus is stabbed in the eye, obviously the cleverness is the way Odysseus makes this giant helpless and defeatable, right? He gets him drunk and then stabs him in his one eye. So in that way, there's a chance to escape. Here's the problem. Here's the genius first. Polyphemus, being stabbed, says, "My friends," he's yelling to the other cyclopes, "my friends, no man is killing me by trick or force, not force." So that's the trick. That's the joke, right? His cyclops buddies are going to hear and say, "Oh, nobody's hurting him. He must be crazy." And there's more to it than that we'll get to later. But Odysseus's plan to escape the cave involves both physical violence and then just the cleverness to weaken the supernaturally strong character. Now, if you go to line 520, in your book, it's actually, go to line 502, 502 on page 256. Odysseus is about to escape. He's about to get where he needs to go safely, and the Cyclops doesn't know who he is. Odysseus actually didn't just give him an alias. He called himself No Man, right? Complete lack of identity. And remember what the Greeks valued the most. They valued kleos. That's how you live forever, is glory, in your name surviving your life and people telling stories about you. If you don't tell who you are, your immortality will be in jeopardy. That being said, whether this is a wise idea or not ends up being pretty clear. Go to line 502. He's on his way out, and Odysseus yells, "Cyclops, if any mortal asks you how your eye was mutilated and made blind, say that Odysseus, the city sacker, Laertes' son, who lives in Ithaca, destroyed your sight." I find it weird that city sacker is the first descriptor he offers of himself, right? His name, and that he's a sacker of cities, maybe because that happened somewhat recently, right? So what ends up happening is that Polyphemus says in the next paragraph that it was prophesied to him that in line 511, a soothsayer, a guy who would predict the future, said, "He told me Odysseus's hands would make me lose my sight." I mean, imagine the odds of that, right? And then go to line 526. Polyphemus, this cannibalistic giant with one eye, prays. But he prayed holding his arms toward the starry sky. "Listen, Earthshaker, blue-haired Poseidon. Acknowledge me, your son, and be my father. Grant that Odysseus, the city sacker," that's 3 times in this chapter that epithet's been named, "will never go back home. Or, if it is fated that he will see his family, then let him get there late and with no honor, in pain and lacking ships and having caused the death of his men, and let him find more trouble in his own house." I need you to just bracket, highlight, put bloodstains, whatever you need to remember that paragraph. This might be the most important paragraph in this entire poem. Polyphemus prays to his father Poseidon, and he asks for 6 things: that Odysseus will never get back home, or that if he's destined to go back home, that he gets there late, and that he gets there with no honor, and that he gets there in pain, and that he gets there lacking ships, and that he would have caused the death of his men. And again, he left for the Trojan War with 12 ships and between 20 and 30 men on each ship. That's who he was responsible for. And then this last thing, that he has trouble in his own house, which is interesting. Here are some things to think about after book 9. First, Consider the three early events after Odysseus and his men leave Troy. So that's the sacker of the next town they see, rape and pillage. That's taking drugs, the lotus flowers, and the incident with Polyphemus. At the end of your reflection, reflect on how you imagine Alcinous's court as they hear Odysseus' stories. Again, don't forget the context. These are people who just met Odysseus very recently, and they're listening to these stories, and this is the guy staying in your house. What do you think they're feeling right now? Talk about that. Or, there's so much to think about in this chapter. Something else that's just worth doing is find a passage on your own that stands out to you, type it out, and then reflect on what stands out to you about it. Well, good luck and happy reading.